Tim, thank you for that extremely generous introduction. And I am honored to be here with all of you because it's an opportunity for us to talk about a university that most of the people in this room are very familiar with because they've committed their lives. I think of the faculty, but I think of the students. They are all my mentors. And so as I offer these reflections, what I ask you to do is to try to contemplate elements that catch your attention that you would like to comment on. So the rich part of this evening will be the conversation that follows. And that can take the form of questions or it can take the form of some observations. I'm very grateful for Nancy Kwan because she's going to look after the technology, something I'm incompetent about. But she will have slides as I make statements. And I'm very grateful for how she has arranged the slides. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the topic of orienting the energies of a university to enhance life in the 21st century. One way of phrasing the question is, how can we make the 21st century an era when the dynamics of peace, justice, and compassion are as transformative as our technology? From the beginning of this lecture, I shall speak to a subset of this broad topic by focusing on the mission of a Catholic university in the 21st century. Since this is my final public lecture as CWL Chair for Catholic Studies, I contemplate St. Mary's University, which is dear to all of us. While the title of this lecture refers to the future, I feel obligated to describe the foundations of a university within the Catholic tradition. I shall try to illustrate how these principles equip St. Mary's to make a unique contribution to the future of Alberta and Canada in the era of robotics, gaming, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence. For corrections, clarification, and enhancement of anything I say, please consult my colleagues on the faculty. Please raise your hands so you will note these wise folks. They and the students at St. Mary's were reference points throughout my preparation of this lecture. St. Mary's has grown because of the creative dynamics that unfold in the classrooms. The staff, administrators, and members of the Board of Governors build on this energy as they develop St. Mary's into a community of learning. Their efforts have allowed me to call St. Mary's my academic home for the past 20 years. You will hear me say over and again that people make the university. In doing so, I echo the sentiments of my colleagues, and hence I invite you right now to contemplate what it means for you to be a unique person related to 7.6 billion sisters and brothers who comprise the human family at this point in time. This focus provides the common ground for conceptualizing any university, and particularly one in the Catholic tradition. I and many of my colleagues hope that every graduate of St. Mary's would view herself as a citizen of the world. My presentation consists of 5 parts. I begin with a short description of the terms university and Catholic. While noting that humanism is the creative force of every university, I describe a distinctive form of humanism, which developed at the Second Vatican Council and which a Catholic university cultivates. This humanism focuses on the uniqueness of each person that emerges when one acts freely according to her conscience. Next, I review Pope Francis's vision of this new humanism, which suggests that bonds to people on the margins of society are essential to a Catholic university. Finally, I describe the university as a place where humanism engages science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, to shape a future that is characterized by genius and compassion. In a brief conclusion, I mention 3 initial steps in the short term that I think are essential for St. Mary's to flourish well into the future. So let's start with the terms university and Catholic. According to the 2-volume Shorter Oxford Dictionary, the noun university derives from the Latin universitas, which refers to the whole, the complete number, or the universe. University is a cognate of the nouns universe and universality, and of the adjective universal. Catholic is originally a Greek adjective, katholikos, that also means universal. Dr. Ilia Delio, a Franciscan sister and professor at Villanova University with PhDs in pharmacology and theology, perceives this term is related to the Greek expression kath holos, which means according to the whole. She invites everyone to understand Catholicity in light of its Greek etymology. She offers this description. Catholicity, like consciousness itself, is not static. It is not a fixed ideal. Rather, it is an outflow of human awareness in relationship to the surrounding world. It is like a connecting thread between the human person and the cosmos. I invite you to note her interpretation of Catholicity as an outflowing of human awareness that connects everything in the cosmos. Catholicity refers to the capacity of a person, society, or institution to perceive that everyone and everything is related to every other person and reality. Hence, a Catholic university forges connections among peoples, cultures, and disciplines of study. Catholicity functions more as a verb than as a noun, since it refers to an ongoing process of making connections that are limitless in number and diversity. The Catholic enterprise is one of whole-making. As a culture, Catholicity provides an environment in which individuals cultivate personal integrity. Each person learns to be at home in her own skin and to embrace her unique heritage and personal history. At the same time, the Catholic environment is one in which strangers make a home with one another. We become ourselves in the company of people who are different from us. Catholic denotes an environment of hospitality that welcomes diversity. And this is why I describe St. Mary's as a meeting ground for persons of all religious tradition and no religious tradition. It is an ethos in which unique individuals celebrate their diversity by recognizing that differences generate complementarity. The corollary of this thesis is that the practice of Catholicity is a matter of overcoming all forms of sectarianism. A Catholic university removes any ideological walls that would separate it from the community at large. You can see I am concerned that we broaden the meaning of Catholic because, as an adjective related to a university, it refers to more than a denomination. I emphasize that a Catholic university is universal on 2 counts, in the adjective Catholic and in the noun university. The term Catholic does mean universal at the origins of the tradition when applied to both the church and a university. Ignatius of Antioch first employed the term Catholic to describe the church when he wrote the letter to the Smyrnians in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, sometime between 107 and 110 of the Common Era. However, in the course of 2,000 years, the current term came to designate a different extension when applied to the universal church than to a university. The Catholic Church, especially through its monasteries, was the matrix of the earliest universities in the West, Bologna in the 11th century and Paris and Oxford in the 12th century. In the wake of the Reformation in the 16th century, many universities became denominational and emphasized doctrinal distinctiveness, whether Protestant or Catholic. The founding and administering of Catholic universities usually became the responsibility of religious orders, such as Benedictines, Franciscans, and Jesuits, each of which developed its distinctive culture of learning. Generally, religious orders operated the universities, while bishops governed dioceses. The Second Vatican Council, which is the 21st Ecumenical or Universal Council of the Church, took place from October 11th of 1962 until December the 8th of 1965. It reflected on great historical developments when it distinguished between the institutional and prophetic dimensions of Catholicism. The bishop, diocesan clergy, and the laity comprised the local institutional church. The men and women in religious orders and lay specialists expressed the prophetic charism of the church by exercising particular ministries, for example, in healthcare and education. The distinction becomes manifest in the respective parameters of central concern. The bishop, diocesan clergy, and lay ministers strengthened the life among baptized Catholics. A school of theology serves this work within a diocese or a region of a country. These authorities work ad intra, that is, within the institution. The term Catholic here refers primarily to a denomination within Christianity. Leaders in hospitals and universities work ad extra, providing care and wisdom to the community at large. A Catholic university engages the world at large. Its constituency is not limited to the Catholic population. Its constituency is people of all religious persuasion and of no religious persuasion. The term Catholic here reflects a primary commitment to animate learning across all cultures, languages, and religions. This corresponds with the vision of the lay people who founded St. Mary's over 30 years ago. Such a university collaborates with the local bishop. However, a Catholic university is not an agent of the diocese in the way a parish is. Moreover, academic freedom, which is the premise that guarantees the integrity of teaching and research, demands that a Catholic university maintain respectful autonomy from the local diocese. The distinction is evident in two premier documents among the 16 at the Second Vatican Council. On one hand, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, called Lumen Gentium, the light to the nations, described the contours of grace within the institutional Church. On the other hand, the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, called Gaudium et Spes, which is joy and hope, expresses the commitment to learn from and to serve all people. This second document expresses the humanism that is central to a Catholic university, and now we turn to that. A Catholic university cultivates humanism. This is the heritage of Vatican II. A distinctive feature of Vatican II was its exploration of the interactions between the interior universe of a person and the external world of society. The Council employed the language of evolution and development to express the symbiotic relationship between what is unfolding inside human beings and the dynamics that are shaping the global community. World history may be viewed as the externalization of the energies in the innermost core of every person. Vatican II identified conscience as the nucleus of the interior life of a person, and social justice as the animating force that makes a society healthy. These are foundational principles of the new humanism that the Council initiated. The conciliar documents profile the individual conscience and personal freedom as the prerequisites that allow people to be authentically themselves. Such authenticity generates the instincts for practicing social justice. One may surmise from these documents that everyone who exercises genuine freedom of conscience instinctively works for justice in the world. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, concentrates on the human person in a manner unprecedented in the 12 previous ecumenical councils. This was the first pastoral constitution in the history of the Church, and as such reoriented the theological enterprise to focus on the actual life experiences of human beings. Previous councils had focused on divinity more than humanity. Personalism runs throughout this document as it attends to issues of conscience, freedom, social justice, and the common good. So let's begin by looking at personalism. Concerns for people run throughout Gaudium et Spes. The document begins with a description of the Church living in solidarity with every human being and concludes with a profile of the Church as an agent of dialogue among all peoples. The opening lines of the Gaudium et Spes highlight affectivity as the energy that generates solidarity between the Church and all people. Feelings of joy, hope, grief, and anguish are the experiences that bond the Church with everyone else, beginning with those who are on the margins of society. People may have different thoughts, but they have common feelings. They may be separated by creeds, but they are united by shared intuitions. Ideologies divide, but love unites. Religious idealism becomes unhealthy when it functions in a manner that represses emotions. Feeling all of our emotions is essential to personal wellness. It is also essential to developing empathy. And ultimately, suffering is the experience that binds each person to every other person and to God, insofar as suffering calls forth compassion. Regarding conscience, a seminal paragraph in the document identifies conscience as the source of being and action that defines each person and shapes the world. Quote, "In the depth of their consciences, women and men discover a law which they have not laid upon themselves, but which they must obey. Each voice, ever calling them to love and to do what is good and avoid what is evil, tells them inwardly at the right moment, do this and avoid that. For they have in their hearts a law inscribed by God. Their dignity rests in observing this law." The text echoes the Apostle Paul and the prophet Jeremiah in biblical texts. Paul asserts that when Gentiles fulfill the demands of biblical law, they do so by acting, quote, according to nature. Their capacity to behave in conformity to Torah is evidence that the moral requirement is written in their hearts. 600 years before Paul, Jeremiah had envisioned the Torah becoming internalized within the consciousness of every Judahite. He calls this the New Covenant, and his tradition viewed it as being actualized in early Judaism, which began with the restoration of Jerusalem and Judah when the exiles returned to the land in 539 BCE. In this new era, moral dictates are experienced not as external prescriptions, but as intuitive wisdom. The authors of Deuteronomy describe this wisdom reservoir as, quote, the word in your heart for you to observe. Vatican II describes this word of God as resounding in the conscience of every person, in every time and place. If you can't relate to the expression word of God, replace it with your muse. That is, the source of intuition and insight that comes from within you, but not from egotism. It is the creative, compassionate voice in your heart. Truth from this source is accompanied by love, and thereby breaks through our self-concern and beckons us to connect with others. Conscience is the faculty through which we relate to ourselves and to other people. Gaudium et Spes portrays conscience as the resource of both personal uniqueness and interpersonal connection, because conscience is the habitation of divine presence. Quote, conscience is the most secret core and inner sanctuary of the human person. There one is alone with God, whose voice echoes in one's depths. Solitude makes a person conscious of her unique identity, with the attendant responsibility to express that uniqueness in her actions. Personal uniqueness is essential to relationships, which naturally occur between individuals who celebrate their differences while finding their common ground in shared intuitions and experiences. Solitude provides the instincts for loving one's neighbors in ways that set them free to be themselves. Every person has a single primary vocation, that is, to become uniquely her or himself. If our fingerprints are unique, our intuitive core is even more unique. A person becomes acquainted with her or his uniqueness by adhering to conscience. Here one learns the art of self-compassion and self-acceptance that overcomes the anxiety which otherwise compels anyone to conform to the expectations of others. Cultivating authentic self-understanding and compassion is a central exercise of personal conscience. As one matures in putting into practice the word in the heart, faithfulness to God becomes synonymous with loyalty to one's innermost being. Conscience is the common ground for all people, believers and atheists alike. Loyalty to one's conscience is the commitment all people have in common. Hence, the Council asserts that atheists will experience eternal life by adhering to the dictates of their consciences. This is why a Catholic university is blessed when its faculty reflects the religious pluralism of society at large. The university is a meeting of equals who embody truth from a full spectrum of convictions related to belief and unbelief. A Catholic university calls for its faculty and students to adhere to their personal conscience at all costs. This is the source of academic freedom and the life force that a university brings to the community. The university creates an environment in which professors and students express their own voice when writing and speaking. Each person is obligated to follow her conscience. Please now what you can do is review a portion of the Statement of Inclusion written by the faculty of St. Mary's University, which corresponds with what I'm trying to describe here. Take your time and read a little bit. Now, let's direct our attention to freedom. Gaudium et Spes emphasizes freedom as the single requirement necessary for the operation of conscience. Quote, "It is, however, only in freedom that people can turn themselves toward what is good. Human dignity therefore requires people to act out of conscious and free choice, as moved and drawn in a personal way from within, and not by their own blind impulses or by external constraint." This positive evaluation of freedom represented a major advancement over statements of popes in the 19th century. In 1832, when denouncing the French priest Félicité de Lamennais and liberal Catholicism, Pope Gregory XVI had described freedom of conscience as a sinister principle that undermined society and jeopardized people's salvation. In 1864, Pope Pius IX reiterated this denunciation in Quanta Cura, the encyclical that accompanied his Syllabus of Errors. Vatican II contradicted these instructions by asserting that freedom of conscience is actually essential to accomplishing what is good and therefore most beneficial to society. This teaching follows the rationale: since human beings are the image of God, the freedom of human beings originates in the freedom of God. Since God does not act by coercion, freedom is essential to an individual's every action. Gaudium et Spes reinforced the bond between freedom and conscience by asserting that the gospel, quote, scrupulously respects the dignity of conscience and its freedom of choice. Such words represent the final withdrawal of opposition to freedom of conscience that had characterized papal teaching in the 19th century. The Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, or Human Dignity, is another document of Vatican II. It insists on the moral obligation of each person to adhere to the religious truth she discovers by free inquiry. Quote, "The search for truth, however, must be carried out in a manner that is appropriate to the dignity and social nature of the human person. That is, by free inquiry with the help of teaching or instruction, communication, and dialogue." The text also states, human beings cannot satisfy this obligation in a way that is in keeping with their own nature unless they enjoy both psychological freedom and immunity from external coercion. Therefore, the right to religious freedom is based on the very nature of the human person. The emphasis on the necessity of free inquiry applies especially to university education. An indication of the distinctive emphasis in this document is its employment of the Latin term libertas, or freedom, and its cognates about 53 times. Think of that number. It occurs 53 times. It's a tiny document. This is in stark contrast when one looks at all the documents of the First Vatican Council, of which there are not many, where the term freedom occurs once. Can you see the difference between the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century? The First Vatican Council took place from 1869 to 1870. The Second Vatican Council also asserted that research in the sciences and humanities must follow universally accepted methods of inquiry into nature without reference to divinity or religion. Similarly, procedures of law and governance that shape societies must derive from research and debate that adhere to the norms of sound human logic and discourse. The rightful autonomy of humankind consists in people freely using the gifts of intellect and judgment to advance learning and enhance society. Let's look at the fourth element of the humanism, which is faith, seen as confidence. The emphasis on freedom of conscience is consistent with the Council's description of faith. Faith is a response to the disclosure of the divine mystery or source of all existence, whom the Abrahamic traditions call God. I intend the term, quote, source of existence, to reflect a Latin term, which is pure esse. Esse is the Latin term for being. This is the description of God by the 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas. I intend the term source of existence as inclusive of feminine and masculine, since both qualities abound equally in the divine mystery. The Catholic tradition identifies three primary sources of this disclosure or revelation of the divine mystery: in creation, in one's personal conscience, and in sacred scripture. The premise is that the ultimate ground of being is personal and is both closer to us than we are to ourselves and infinitely more extensive than the cosmos. The dynamics of interpersonal relationships provide the template. Friendships develop when people spend time with each other. Each one becomes familiar with the other person's manner of being and is attracted by qualities of honesty, kindness, or authenticity. Words are important, But the other person's manner of being and relating is more important. The relationship can grow insofar as you sense that you can trust the other person. You cannot trust their words alone. You need to discern whether the other person is reliable enough to let into your life. Applying this template to the relationship human beings develop with the divine mystery, theologians identify two aspects of faith. One is trusting God, and the other is adhering to specific doctrines. The first aspect of faith is that one believes. The second aspect is what one believes. The first is called fides qua in Latin, the second fides quae. In terms of relating to the divine mystery, that one believes or trusts is primary and is the premise for grappling with what one believes. This trust is an existential disposition, the opposite of which is fear, anxiety, or insecurity, which innately resides within each person. Faith is primarily a confidence that reality is reliable and that the source of reality is reliable. Such trust makes relationships possible because it frees us from egotism. Insofar as we become free of self-preoccupation, we are able to love another person. This is the faith that is emblematic of Abraham in the Bible. We read in the book of Genesis, Abram trusted God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. This trust is at the heart of the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Paul interprets this tradition when he asserts that the only thing that matters is faith or trust working through love. This is the faith that connects one to the divine mystery, to the cosmos, to everyone, to everything, and to one's true self. One is grounded in the awareness that she or he uniquely belongs here, now. As a disposition, this confidence pertains to emotional intelligence. It is not sectarian. It is the disposition that is foundational to personal authenticity. This trust is the faith at the heart of a Catholic university. This is what we mean by faith in a Catholic university. Moreover, a Catholic university makes an explicit commitment to create an environment in which each person, whether student, faculty member, or member of staff, becomes ever more genuinely her true self. What you believe, fides quae, pertains to dogmas, doctrines, and prescriptions, and is always secondary to the experience of trust. What you believe is the vital concern of schools of theology. Nevertheless, it is always derivative and secondary to trusting God. Lived experience tests the authenticity of dogmas. The matters of what you believe highlight the distinctiveness of each religion and denomination. However, that you trust is the common ground of all religions and derivatively of all people. Pope Francis emphasizes fides qua, this element of trust, when he says ideologies divide. However, we all become united by our shared experiences of growing in authenticity, so that we love every person, especially the stranger and the refugee. Let's now think about the social location of a Catholic university, which is humanism on the margins of society. Now you're in the orbit of Pope Francis. He does this over and over again. I now illustrate the tradition of Vatican II in the era of Pope Francis. On November 10th of 2015, in the Church of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, Pope Francis addressed the fifth conference of the Italian Association of Lay People to reflect on the contours of a new humanism that would be adequate to the 21st century. The setting in this particular cathedral was most appropriate in the city that had developed humanism during the Renaissance. Pope Francis spoke under the dome which Filippo Brunelleschi had designed and manufactured as a revolutionary turning point in architecture and technology in the 15th century. Within these historical environs, Pope Francis called for a new humanism that stands in continuity with the Renaissance insofar as it actively spearheads the human adventure. At the same time, he distinguished this new humanism from that of the Renaissance. Rather than focusing on the David, which Michelangelo had depicted as embodying prosperity, youth, vigor, and strength for leadership, the new humanism focuses on Jesus of Nazareth according to this description by Pope Francis. His face is similar to that of so many of our sisters and brothers, humiliated, rendered slaves, and emptied. God took on their face. If we do not lower ourselves, we cannot see the face of God. Every person who is marginalized, betrayed, and abused is the face of the new humanism. That person makes a claim on every other person to communicate solidarity and friendship with a commitment to work for social justice on her or his behalf. Pope Francis emphasized that this new humanism is embodied in action rather than in speculation and art alone. The enterprise central to this humanism consists in getting people out of their churches and into the streets. Everyone will experience this humanism in the environs of people on the margins of society. This humanism is built upon relationships. He asserts, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out on the streets rather than a church which is unhealthy, from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center and which then ends up by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. Engaging the messiness of life with compassion defies all systems. However, such engagement transforms human beings through love that originates in God. The artisan of this humanism is every person who becomes an agent of encounter and dialogue, especially with people who suffer social marginalization. Francis's expression here describes the culture of a university. That is, a place of encounter and dialogue, that is a meeting ground for people of all traditions and no tradition. Their objective is to enhance the lives of everyone, beginning with people on the margins of society. Now let's look at a Catholic university in the age of artificial intelligence. In this final section, I provide some indications of how a university, such as St. Mary's, can make a unique contribution to society over the next 30 years. A central project for any university now is to establish a conversation between the humanities and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. STEM has produced the breathtaking inventions of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and digital currencies. Conversation with humanities and social sciences is vital to orienting these advances to the preservation of the planet and the betterment of life for all people and all sentient beings. I have emphasized that the disposition of trust in or openness to God, the source of existence, is the faith at the heart of a Catholic university. This internal sense of confidence is the resource through which each person develops into a unique self that relates to everyone and everything with empathy and wisdom. I propose that cultivating emotional intelligence is central to the mission of a Catholic university. Emotional intelligence derives from exploring the dynamics of one's interior universe. We have called these energies feelings, emotions, and intuitions. They are the sources of the creative imagination that produces inspiring music, art, dance, literature, and drama, whether on stage or in film. When coalesced into courage, emotions provide the bonds of collaboration that generate movements of justice and peace on behalf of people, all sentient beings, and the planet Earth. Emotional intelligence derives from listening to one's innermost being and working through afflictive emotions so that one can listen with empathy to others. It develops in places where people work from the inside out. The atmosphere is quiet because people are drawing upon their internal energies. For Christy and me, this is the atmosphere that we think of, which for us was emblematic of St. John's College at the University of Cambridge a year ago. Within that environment, there were no cell phones and no message boards, but only people composing papers, poetry, and music, or else participating in conversations that lead to inventions to benefit the world. This is the enterprise of contemplative collaboration that emerges from inside individuals and flows outward to advance society at large. Universities have been places for mental and intellectual development. They are graduating students who have unprecedented skills in science, technology, engineering, and math. However, in order to harness artificial intelligence and virtual reality for the common good, we need emotional intelligence. Universities and businesses are developing programs in emotional intelligence. The University of Virginia now has a Contemplative Sciences Center. The center has subdivisions that bear such titles as Compassionate Schools Project, Leading Mindfully, and Student Flourishing Initiative. The Stanford Medical School has a Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Mindfulness is the subject of the enormously popular Wisdom 2.0 conferences. You can just Google Wisdom 2.0 to get the talks. These originated in Google. Christy and I attended one of their conferences in 2011. Silicon Valley is committed to mindfulness. Soren Gordhammer, formerly the director of the actor Richard Gere's Outreaches to Impoverished Children in Africa, coordinates the seminars. They bring together leaders in business, technology, and neuroscience to describe the centrality of meditation and mindfulness to creativity. The mindfulness practices derive primarily from Buddhist traditions, especially the Vajrayana tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Emotional intelligence is at the heart of all religious traditions. It flourishes now through the encounter between the traditions of East and West. Experience is demonstrating that the dominant cultures in the north and west of the planet do not have the spiritual resources sufficient for preserving the earth. Silicon Valley has had the humility to learn from the rich spiritual traditions of the East. Perhaps most significantly, the Buddhist tradition of Tibet is suffused with elements of the Pern Aboriginal tradition that was in the Himalayas prior to the monks coming from northeast India in the first millennium of the Common Era. However, as Tim mentioned at the introduction, in Western Canada, we need to realize that the Aboriginal peoples, who are the earliest inhabitants of the land, have maintained a contemplative consciousness. They need to become our teachers in listening to the earth and the animals. They have mindfulness and community consciousness in their psyches. We recognize that we need to reverse the damage of residential schools. Essential to that recovery is allowing First Nations peoples to transform the consciousness of us who are the descendants of European settlers. The First Nations people of Canada have the instincts for living in communion with the earth and all sentient beings right here in the locale that we now inhabit. We need their guidance and their languages. At the opening of the UN Week of Harmony Among Religions on February 1st, down at the City Hall, the mayor was there, he gave a speech. There was a woman from the Stony Reserve who said, I want you to understand that my language is important because my language is what originated with the animals. We listen to the animals, their echoes are in my language. It's important for the next generation of my people to have that language. So there's hope that we can all be sensitized to the living beings that are with us, and so that we are safe for them to be with, so that they are safe to be with us. The oppression of Native peoples is at the origins of the oppression of the earth. We need to reverse this oppression by receiving their teaching. I wish to emphasize that the leadership of women in movements to preserve the earth and govern nations can give us confidence for the future. Emotional intelligence will flourish under the leadership of women. All of the church documents that I referenced in this talk came from only the masculine side of the human consciousness. They need to be reinterpreted by feminist scholars and leaders. Feminist studies and cross-cultural engagement, particularly led by women, will open the future of humankind and the planet. My hope is that in the foreseeable future, they will propel this Catholic University of St. Mary's well beyond what I am outlining here. For conclusion. In this conclusion, I outline 3 short-term action steps that I think are important for St. Mary's to grow as a university from this point forward. The first relates to the principle that ideologies divide, but compassion unites. I invite you to consider right now whether from your life experience the adjective Catholic is a term that bespeaks unity or separation. I want to clearly state that Catholic must not connote censorship and isolationism. To employ it with this connotation is to misunderstand and to deface it. The adjective actually bears the opposite meaning. Catholic is a term that denotes inclusion and solidarity with all people. We are in a shameful situation insofar as the term Catholic in common parlance too often bespeaks a censorious or judgmental stance toward modernity. We need to appreciate this term at an intuitive level as describing engagement that derives from exercising the freedom of personal conscience. The best way to rebrand the term is for the administration, faculty, staff, and Board of Governors at St. Mary's to concentrate on what it means to build a university. The collaborative engagement in doing this work will exemplify what it means for this university to be Catholic at this point in time. Actions illustrate the meaning of words. Catholicity functions as a verb that refers to whole-making, integrity, and connection. These words describe the processes that are integral to the building of this university. Secondly, this university will grow to the degree that it embodies the humanism that is at the heart of the Catholic enterprise today. A small university such as this one is a personal work and therefore needs to develop from the inside outward. The freedom to be one's best self generates the synergy that animates this community of learning. The members of the faculty at St. Mary's are remarkably gifted people who care for their students. St. Mary's will flourish to the degree that each of them is able to affirm personally on a daily basis a statement such as this: St. Mary's is the place where I can do my best work. The same applies equally to the remarkably generous members of the staff and administration. If each person feels confident to point out where the environment is not conducive to personal creativity, the university community will then discern how to make the environment ever more conducive to wellness and creativity. The creativity will result in superb interdisciplinary adventures that connect the sciences with the humanities. It will also generate programs in lifelong learning where leaders in business and government will be in creative dialogue with academics and leaders of Aboriginal and interfaith communities to enhance community building across Alberta. Thirdly, I suggest that St. Mary's would benefit from seeking out a mature Catholic university or network of such universities that could serve as its mentors. I suggest these universities need to be led by lay people, since St. Mary's is a lay foundation. Since I benefited from a Jesuit education, I favor connecting with that tradition in places like Georgetown or Santa Clara or Seattle. The essential qualities that we need to look for in mentor universities is a rich diversity in personnel, in disciplines, cultures, community engagement, and opportunities to study abroad, especially in developing countries. In class, I sometimes make the comment that we can evaluate our personal relational health by reviewing the range of diversity in our friendship. We can contemplate the spectrum of our friends according to their differences in age, race, ethnicity, country of origin, languages, the manner in which people identify themselves according to the various terminology related to sex and gender, LGBTQ, and it goes on, as Dr. Henderson taught us. Another category is religion, another is social standing and occupations. The greater the diversity of our friendships, the healthier we are, and the greater will be our creativity in raising our families and contributing to our communities. What I describe here about each one of us applies to standards by which we might estimate the health of a university, especially one that specializes in the humanities. The greater the diversity in its student body, as well as in its faculty, staff, and administrators, the healthier is the university, and the higher is its potential for contributing to society in Alberta, which will become ever more diversified in the coming decades. Such is the Catholic project, and I thank you for contemplating it this evening.
We want to open the discussion now to all of you who are here. If you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand and I will make my way to you. And just for ease and continuity, I'll hold the mic, just because I'm a control freak. But we open the conversation now to you all to ask Michael Duggan what's on your minds from the wisdom that he shared with us this evening.
Hi, Bob Schultz, University of Calgary. Mike and I are longtime friends. My human, Christy, went to Wisdom 2.0. I'm taking a team to Connecticut Hackathon. The whole idea is to have technology go help refugees, migrants, interfaith dialogue, whatever. Most people think technology is over here, humanism is way over there. Can you help me out here and having some ideas of things that you saw? Because Google is sponsoring where I'm going, and Google also sponsored where you were.
Thanks, Bob. So I hope everybody knows Dr. Bob Schultz. He is one of the great connectors in the city of Calgary, and I'm honored that Bob and I have had a friendship that goes back over 40 years. And Bob had a team, by the way, that was trying to win the Hulk Prize, which is a worldwide competition for $1 million prize that he was going to devote to helping refugees. And the competition was identified by Bill Clinton, I think, was it? They finished second in the world and just missed. But Bob knows this world, so I say that so you can visit with him. In terms of Google and what Christy and I experienced, I'll give you just an example. There's a few different examples. One that I tell many people is one of the people who was speaking was Arianna Huffington, who founded the Huffington Post. And she's a great fan of the Wisdom 2.0. You can, if you Google 2.0, you'll come up with her. And Soren Gordhammer asked her, well, how did you start getting into a mindfulness practice and meditation? And by the way, she goes into quite an extensive description of her background because she grew up and she very much values her identity as an Orthodox Christian who grew up in Greece, in the world of Orthodox Christianity. She doesn't speak of that explicitly, but she identifies it. And she said, well, I was at my desk one day, and of course her paper was in 183 countries or whatever, and she said, I got up from my chair and my head smashed into the desk, and I broke my cheekbone. And it was then that I realized I was tired. It struck me, there is something missing here. And so she said, then I said, what is the answer? And then she got, this is 7 years ago, another aeon in terms of technology, but she got her people in technology to develop an app called GPS for the Soul to get people to stop every hour, do breathing, meditation. There was another person at the conference named Chadimen Tang. He's a person that you and he would have an interesting conversation, Bob, because he's like you. When you go to his website, he says, my intention is to teach everybody and bring peace to the world. I'll do that in my spare time. So Chadimen Tang is a Stanford-trained engineer who had a Buddhist background, and what they realized at Google was people at 40 years old were being burnt out, these geniuses in the technology. And he said, what they asked me to do was to go and meet with people in their office and introduce them to themselves. And I would teach them that there is a whole world inside of you that you might be missing because you are so involved in the wires in your computer. So let's see if we could meet this person, and actually, you might be running away from this person. It's not a good idea to do that. And he's written a book called Search Inside Yourself. You can pick up the book. It's deceptively easy to read, difficult to practice. But there is an example of a person who is embodying this connection between STEM and the resources of emotional intelligence. Please understand, they're not just prescribing techniques. They're asking people to learn what it means to find vocabulary to understand the various energies inside of yourself. As an example, the traditions that they describe, one of which I'm somewhat familiar with in Tibetan Buddhism, when they speak of meditation, here's what they say, is meditation consists in allowing the subtle energies of the body to inform the mind. Do you see how different that is from having mind over matter? So that's the type of thing that they do. Arianna Huffington has got out of Huffington Post because she says, I'm doing something much more important, which is I want to teach people how to sleep. People no longer know how to sleep, and they are not able to be themselves. Stop. Okay?
Anyone else?
Julia.
Just giving it up. Thank you very much. My name is Julia Duchamp. I teach in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary, and it's certainly a privilege to be here.
Juliet, can you speak a little louder so
Sorry, is that
Father
better?
Pate can hear you? No?
I'm wondering the extent to which you think St. Mary's University is at risk or under threat from people who are dogmatists. And when I ask you that question, I think of my childhood going to Sacred Heart School, in 14th Street and 17th Avenue. One of my friends found herself pregnant in grade 11. And her parents, in response, being traditional Catholics, moved her out of their house. She was on her own. And I was completely unprepared to know what to do for her because what she had done was completely taboo. And I felt that I was unprepared to respond to my conscience, as you encourage us to do. And I'm wondering whether that sort of thinking threatens St. Mary's University.
Well, I think everyone here recognizes that we live in a world that is very, very confusing. And so in relationship to the unsettlement, some people find that they move to a dogmatism. And that comes out of a desire to do everything correctly. I want to do everything correctly. Such people quite often are very hard on themselves, and then they become very hard on others. And the answer to your question is yes. I think any institution of learning is susceptible to the kind of criticism that does not come from dialogue, but comes from condemnation. Now let me read you something that comes from someone who speaks much more strongly than I do sometimes. And here it is. This is a person who's talking about elements inside the church. He says, this attempt to build structures leads us to assume a controlling, harsh, and normative manner. Norms give this type of energy the security of feeling superior, of having a precise bearing. This is where it finds its strength, not in the lightness of the Spirit's breath. Before the evils or problems of the church, it is useless to seek solutions in conservatism and fundamentalism, in the restoration of obsolete practices and forms that even culturally lack the capacity to be meaningful. Christian doctrine is not a closed system incapable of raising questions, doubts, inquiries, but is living and is able to unsettle and is able to enliven. That's Pope Francis. And what he is describing for himself is running up against this. And what he is trying to do consistently is say, if we can get to emotional intelligence, which we will learn by getting over our head, by talking to any other person and listening to them, to allow them to break down all of our certainties, then there is hope. And that's why universities need to develop the emotional intelligence. Otherwise, it's a battle of ideologies. And he's saying ideologies divide. That's why he makes this type of statement. And so, yes, the risk, the danger is there. We see in the United States this roaring, wild world that is all divided on ideologies. It's all, do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? It's what Dr. Henderson was talking of these bipolarities, this dualism. You're either with me or you're against me. But at the core of our being, we're all one. We all have the same fears. We all have the same hopes. We all have the same capacity to love. And that's where we have to get. But you're absolutely right. This is the threat to education. This is why, if I could build on that, Juliet, this is why one of the great challenges we have, and I'm sure you have, is helping students to deal with fake news. How can you detect whether what you are reading anywhere now is coming from an authentic person? How can you detect it? And that's how mad this has all become. It's just a battle of words. And the sad part is it's violent because there's so much insecurity that is fueling fundamentalism. And it is enormous.
Sorry if I don't formulate the question right, but if we look at the university, closer? No, it's too loud. Sorry. If we look at the university, particularly St. Mary's, as you say, in the Catholic sense, and a Catholic not as Roman Catholic or not as a religious Catholic, but as a sort of Catholic universality, what's the value of having this university as against the University of Calgary or Mount Royal University, if those universities have the same, or attempt to have the same, universality, wouldn't the effort of this university be better placed in transforming these other universities if they have failed or have not achieved the universality and Catholicness of St. Mary's? Why make the effort here and not make a transformative effort in the other university institutions of this community? What is the value of this university if its values are transferable to other universities that aren't in the Catholic religious tradition?
This is a great question for all of us to contemplate. So here's how the tradition responds to it, from Vatican II to the present. And you have instructions by Pope Paul VI, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis. And what is distinctive about the Catholic tradition in a university is what is called a different type of humanism. It's called transcendent humanism, it's called a new humanism, it's called an integral humanism. That comes from the French word, a holistic humanism. So while we can say all universities derive from a humanism, what is distinctive in the Catholic tradition is a conviction that what is at the core of human beings does not originate with the individual human being. It originates with the ultimate mystery that brought all things into existence. And the challenge in this type of university is to develop a consciousness that I am not the center of the world. Now that is something that you do not have an opportunity to say really clearly in all universities. If you just think of universities that are developing very skilled people who say you can become whoever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can live out your dream. All of those are wonderful statements. But are they saying, but there is a uniqueness in you that you have to search out, that you are going to engage, and it is tied up with this understanding of accepting not just your positive parts, but your failures, your gaps. And yet at the core within you, you have this awareness that I do not live for myself. I have to become well enough to care for another person. Now, in that humanism, you have a distinct tradition among universities. Now, that's what we call transcendent humanism. Obviously, within the core of that, within a Catholic university, you have a faith community, but not a faith community that is narrowly sectarian. It has to have liturgy. It has to have sacraments. But it also has to have interreligious conversation going on. And that is where it becomes a meeting ground where people can speak about their practices and about what it means to feel that I am this human being in this tradition, with this culture, so that I can collaborate with other people. In other universities, what we have, what I think what happens quite often, and I don't want to diminish anything that other universities are doing. I think they all have great benefits. But what quite often happens when it comes to issues about religion is people speak in terms of sociology and opinion, but there is a point at which, in talking about experience, people would say, well, this is moving too far away from objective studies. And that's where you have this grounding in the Catholic universities that has been very successful. So you have an example, for instance, of Matteo Ricci, who is a Jesuit. Father Pate could tell us about him, who in the 16th century went to the court of the emperor in Beijing, and he taught Confucianism. And when the emperor and the people at the court listened to him, they said, you know about this with great expertise, and you're a master. What's your tradition? And that allowed him to say, here's my tradition. But that's what that kind of teaching does. It's not him going and saying, you must think like me. It's him going and saying, I want to understand you. And then you can ask questions of me, well, what is it that has caused you to get so interested in us that you can connect with us? It's not a full answer to your question, but it's a pathway that we're talking about.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Thank you. Well, Michael, you just said that people who believe in dogmas, they're very sincere people. They want to do things right. But people who believe in dogmas, they become narrow-minded. And you also said that ideology creates friction and division. So those people who believe in dogmas, they have their own ideology. And this ideology leads to fanaticism. So what's the difference between these three terms?
The three terms being dogma, ideology, and fanaticism? Okay. What's the difference? I think they're all connected. Now, of course, and I'm very grateful for your comments, because do you mind just explaining to everyone your tradition and where we're coming from? This is another wonderful friend of mine. Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, my parents believed in Sikhism, but they were very broad-minded people. They said, okay, believe. First you find out what you want to believe in, and then believe in that faith.
Great.
So after I retired, when I was 60, I retired, and now I'm in my 80s. So I started to study philosophies of different religions. So I discovered that philosophy of Vedanta is a very vast and highest philosophy, which is the height of knowledge.
Yes.
So for that reason, I have become a Vedantist.
Great. So this is a conversation we have up at the Hindu Mandir. I've been grateful to take part in classes there. Vedanta, of course, in the great tradition of Sanatana Dharma, says that everything is one. It's what we were talking about related to Catholicity. it all converges on one. And of course, in the great traditions of Hinduism, everybody has pathways. There's 550 million deities. They're all energies. But they all converge on one. So the point that you're making is very important, because if a person believes that God is one, then a person has to believe that reality is one. And then anything that is a dogma or a doctrine has to be a reflection on the integration of all reality. It cannot become sectarian. And that's a very, very important principle, that principle of oneness across traditions, but it's also instinctive in all of us. So let me just leave it at that, because your point about sectarianism and about fanaticism and about ideologies, what is common to all of those descriptors is they're pointing to a type of statement or thinking or let's say, assertion that's divisive. Only a few have the right path. The many are lost. And when we're in that world, we're outside the world of God. Because the scandal of God to every one of us is that God makes people who are so different from us, we're not sure that we can be with them. And that's how we get redeemed, if I can use it, from our own fears and self-preoccupation, is to meet someone who's really different. And then we start to experience what oneness is. Oneness is not sameness. Oneness is not conformity. Oneness is not adhering to these particular precepts that says, well, you and I think the same, but nobody else thinks the same, so we are smart, but they aren't. Well, we all know that doesn't correspond to reality. So if I could just build on that by saying it's oneness that is the let's say the defining reality, the defining nature of ultimate reality.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this presentation this evening. In view of the questions, I would just like to affirm the general pattern of your presentation through a reflection on my own life, which I started out as a Roman Catholic, and I learned the Baltimore Catechism by heart, and I was raised in an ethnic church in western Massachusetts and so on. And then I came to Canada to attend St. Francis Xavier University, which was primarily priests and sisters teaching, and very strong in the Catholic tradition and so on. And I ended up spending my life there before coming out here to St. Mary's 20 years ago. The thing I see about the integration of this idea of the Catholic University adhering to tradition and being dominated by dogma and doctrine, in my life that was changed by my life experiences. That when I left the little valley that I had been born in Massachusetts and went into the world and came, first of all, to another country which was very different from the United States, but a free and independent country, it began to change my views. I ran into and worked with Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. I became aware of blacks in the Halifax area. Then I went to Ireland. Then I went to Salzburg. I learned about people from behind the Iron Curtain. I joined a society where I debated with atheist professors and so on. And the bottom line is that we must change as our knowledge and the ability to discern with our conscience is informed by our life experience. And that's what I see is happening right now. St. FX is no longer a strictly Catholic college. St. Mary's is a representation of great diversity in all its aspects. And all of that is positive. It's headed in the direction that you have pointed to us, and I just close in appreciation for what you've given us this evening. Thank you.
Nancy, did you have a question? I saw Nancy prior to going over here.
Michael, I just wanted to thank you for a really informative and inspirational talk. What you speak of is what many of us have given our lives to here at St. Mary's University. And your words, for me, provide encouragement and affirmation of the work that we're doing. This talk and all of your work will be your legacy that you leave at St. Mary's, and you will be greatly missed. And we are extremely grateful for you and all that you've spoken to us tonight. I took some notes as you were speaking of some words that you, and some sentences, because there's so many of them that I will take home and meditate on over the next weeks and months. Some things that really spoke to me were, you said, lived experiences test the authenticity of dogma. You spoke about conscience being a common ground for all people, believers and atheists alike. I was caught by Pope Francis's comment that he prefers a church which is bruised from its service rather than a church caught up in procedures and obsessions. And so I get the idea that you and Pope Francis are asking us to think about some pretty important things. You seem to be hitting home the importance of living a life which honors our personal experiences, feeling our own feelings, and avoiding external coercion. And I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit more about that. You've given us a lot to think about, but particularly in terms of our university here on campus.
Well, I started by saying that when I wrote the lecture, I had in mind my colleagues and the students at St. Mary's. That wasn't a throwaway piece. That actually is it. And it corresponds with what Pat was saying and what you're mentioning too, Nancy, which is that we learn from people. And so whatever I presented here, of course it goes back to some studies that I had the opportunity to do, but it is looking at how people who are on the faculty, particularly at St. Mary's, and students go about their life here. And I'm thinking in particular of people, certainly on the faculty, where they set aside their own, let's say, sometimes their research schedule in order to help students, just help them. I think of the number of people who come to your office. And I think of students who have the courage to come to St. Mary's, some of whom are going through enormous transformations in their life, And I'm grateful that some of them found this to be a safe place to do so. So for me, the learning process is like for all of us, which is getting to know people. But central to my learning process is this. We need to count it a blessing when somebody tells us, you are wrong. I have heard that inside of myself in ways that sometimes were quite overwhelming. It was the best possible thing I could have heard. And that's the beginning of working to what Pope Francis calls a new humanism. The enemy of new humanism is any attempt at personal perfectionism. It's any attempt to build a perfect university, any attempt, and what the Catholic agenda was described as, sometimes in the 19th century, as the church is a perfect society. That meant it was a very, very harsh world, a world in which there was no freedom of thought, in which nobody could be good enough. And so what the new humanism demands of all of us is to count it a blessing when we meet someone who embodies difference for us that previously we would have passed judgment on, and we finally have the opportunity to stop and say, this person needs to be my teacher. That's the key. That's the key. That's the key to a university. That's the key to a faculty. That's the key. And then we have a university that is a community of listeners, first of all, a community of learners, and a community of people that say, if I feel disturbed, I have to ask myself, is it something in me that I have to address, or is it something that I need to exercise patience and loving kindness about toward another person and give them an environment where it's safe for them to address it? But that's the wisdom that we need. That's the wisdom. And it does not come from ideological certainty. The human experience of any particular individual will break apart every ideological certainty anybody attempts to construct.